Hi, Eric. This is David. We're going live on YouTube, so as soon as there's quorum and you guys are ready to start, you can go ahead.
Thanks, David. I'm counting quorum right now. John, I think we have a quorum now, so I think we can get started.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. Let's call to order the MAG Management Committee. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll need to take a roll call by city or town, as we've done the last 2 to 3 meetings. Ensure we do have a quorum present and identify all who is participating. So if you could please let me know who is representing the member agency. And I'll just start alphabetically, starting with Apache Junction. Apache Junction, is anybody on the line? ADOT.
Eric Gulino, representing ADOT.
All right, thank you, Eric. Avondale? Anybody from Avondale? Buckeye?
Roger Klingler here.
Thank you, Roger. Carefree? Anyone from Carefree? Cave Creek? Chandler?
Hey, John, it's Marcia Reed.
Hi, Marcia. El
Hi.
Mirage?
Hey, John, it's Amber Wakeman, City of El Mirage.
Thank you, Amber. Florence?
Brent Billingsley.
Hi, Brent. Fort McDowell, Yavapai Nation. Fountain Hills?
Grady Miller for Fountain Hills.
Okay, Grady. Gila Bend? Gila River Indian Community? Gilbert? Glendale?
Good afternoon, Mr. Cross. This is Kevin.
Hi, Kevin. Goodyear?
Julie Arundel for Goodyear.
All right, Julie. Guadalupe?
Jeff Calaga, Guadalupe.
All right, Jeff. Litchfield Park? Maricopa County?
Reed Spalding.
All right, Reed. City of Maricopa? Mesa?
Chris Brady's here.
All right, Chris. Paradise Valley? Peoria?
Hi, Jeff's here.
Hi, Jeff. Phoenix?
Ed Zerker's here, John.
Hi, Ed. Pinal County?
Andy Smith is here.
Okay, Andy. And Queen Creek is here. RPTA, Valley Metro.
Scott Smith's here.
All right, Scott. Salt River, Pima, Maricopa Indian Community. Scottsdale.
Hi, John. Brad Lundahl's here.
Hi, Brad. Surprise. Tempe. Tempe. Tolleson. Wickenburg. And Youngtown. And did I miss anybody? Okay, it looks like we've got a quorum. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate that. The web conference meeting of the MAG Management Committee is called to order. And if everybody could please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
To the flag,
United States of America,
States of America, and to the republic
for
which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. Just some housekeeping items as we move along here. Just please remember to mute your phone when you are not speaking. And members of the public were asked to submit written comments related to this meeting on the MAG website within 1 hour of the posted start time for the meeting. We did not receive any comments. Let's move on to the Executive Director's Report, item 3. Our next item will be delivered by MAG's Executive Director, Eric Anderson. Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Management Committee. We can go to the next slide. Talk about our heat relief network. Obviously, with temperatures reaching triple digits, our heat relief network is extremely important in terms of having keep people hydrated out there. I want to point to that first bullet there. This year we have 37 donation locations and 55 hydration locations, significantly less than last year. And that's largely due to the fact that we have the COVID-19 pandemic that we're dealing with too. It's really important that we're short on water donations. And so if we can ask you to spread the word that we need additional water donations for our heat relief network. I really would appreciate that. Go to the next slide. In terms of the census 2020, our response rates for Maricopa County about 61.7%, Pinal County about 51.6%. That compares to the national average of about right under 61% and the state average of 57%. We have some member agencies that are doing really well. We do need to pick up the pace. As you know, the deadline has been extended now, and because of the coronavirus pandemic. So census will be ramping up their efforts to make contact with people who have not filled out their census yet. Extremely important in terms of revenue sharing and planning activities like what MAG does. So it's really important we have a good count. Go to the next slide. Wanted to just bring you up to speed. We have a meeting and office space safety assessment underway. We have a firm out of underway doing that. We held a stakeholders meeting to discuss what our stakeholders think we need to do. Obviously, we need to make sure our building is safe. We're coordinating with the City of Phoenix. This is a City of Phoenix facility. We want to make sure that our efforts are coordinated with building security too. And so see that over the next few months. You'll see the results of that study. We may end up doing some different protocols for meetings when we return to our offices, but more to come on that too. Go to the next slide. I'm also happy to report that our once again, our work program received the GFOA award. This is the 20th year in a year 20th year in a row that our annual budget work program has won this award. So once again, very proud of that. It's something that we want to make sure that our administrative documents, such as our budget work program, are readily available to our member agencies, and they meet the highest standards out there for reporting. So, Mr. Chairman, that completes my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Eric, for that report. We appreciate it. Congratulations on the GFOA award there. And then if anybody has any questions come to mind afterward, do see Eric about that. Let's go ahead and go on to item 4, which is the approval of the consent agenda. Items 4A through 4K are on the consent agenda. Does any member of the management committee have a question or would like a presentation on any of the items on the consent agenda? All right, not hearing anyone. Could I have a motion to recommend approval of the consent agenda from items 4A through 4K?
Roger from Buckeye moves approval.
And second, this is Marcia.
All right, we've got a motion from Roger Klingler and a second from Marcia Reed. Any further discussion on the motion? All right, not hearing any. I have to go through the roll call once again, so bear with me. I'm going to start alphabetically. I'll start with Apache Junction. What is your vote?
Yes.
Thank you. ADOT?
Yes.
Thank you. Avondale? Buckeye?
Aye.
Carefree? Cave Creek? Chandler?
Yes.
El Mirage?
Yes.
Florence?
Aye.
Fort McDowell? Yavapai Nation? Mountain Hills?
Aye.
Gila Bend? Gila River Indian Community? Gilbert? Glendale?
Aye.
Goodyear?
Aye.
Guadalupe?
Aye.
Litchfield Park?
Aye.
Maricopa County?
Aye.
Maricopa? Mesa?
Aye.
Paradise Valley? Peoria?
Aye.
Phoenix?
Yes.
Pinal County.
Aye.
Queen Creek is an aye. RPTA Valley Metro.
Yahoo.
All right. Salt River, Pima, Maricopa Indian Community. Scottsdale.
Aye.
Surprise. Tempe. Tolleson. Wickenburg. And Youngtown. Did I miss anyone? All right. Looks like we've got the unanimous approval of the consent agenda. Let's move on to item 5, which is the coronavirus update. A response, or the regional response to the pandemic will be provided by Mr. Anderson. Eric, I believe you're leading this discussion.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Management Committee. As you know, we've been tracking a number of indicators on the coronavirus pandemic, including mapping the healthcare sites. I want to shout out to our regional analytics division who took the initiative to do that. We've also mapped unemployment claims by zip code, a number of other things too. What I want to do today is just go to the next slide, run through some of the transportation related factors that we've seen out there on the system. We go to the next slide. There we go. So traffic volumes, we're slowly returning to what we refer to as normal. Normal, we're comparing things to the first week in March of this year. We saw our traffic volumes drop to a little under 2/3 of normal, or about 1/3 less than normal levels. We're about 83% today relative to that first part of March. Keep in mind we're entering the summer season, so those numbers are probably a gap where we would be in a normal situation, and the 83% is probably closer than what this indicates today. Go to the next slide. Of course, with lower levels of traffic, our congestion levels are down. We were down in terms of hours of delay in about 45% of that normalized week in March again. We've come back up a little bit, but again, traffic congestion is not a linear relationship with traffic volumes. And so we expect that as our volumes continue to pick up, that we'll have more delay on our system. Go to the next slide. Interestingly, compared to last year, so these are the same weeks that I had on the previous slide, but this is comparison to congestion delay last year, 2019. You'll notice the first couple weeks in March, we were actually 15 to 20% higher than last year in terms of delay on the system. Again, we had a very robust economy going, height of spring training kicking off that first couple weeks in March. And then you can see the impact of the stay-at-home orders where our delay fell significantly. We're back up. We're continuing to you see that trend line as things are opening back up. So we expect that congestion will continue to increase too. Go to the next slide. In terms of heavy truck volume, we saw an immediate very short-term drop in truck volumes when the stay-at-home orders first were issued in Arizona. But you'll see that certainly in the last 4 to 6 weeks, volumes are actually higher than they were on the first week in March. So heavy truck activity has continued to pretty much stay the course compared to where it was earlier this year. Next slide. One of the other data sources we looked at is our weekday trips. And so this is a comparison of April 2019 trips by time of day, average time of day this year compared to last year. This year's bars are the ones in orange. Last year are the number of trips in 2019. And so you'll see a big difference in terms of where we spiked last year versus this year by time of day. Overall, the daily pattern is pretty similar to where it was last year. You can go to the next slide. And then the other thing we're tracking, nitrogen dioxide emissions. This is a precursor to the ozone formation. You'll see that these two charts, one from last year, the one on the left, 2019 versus the one on the right in 2020. 2020 emissions or nitrogen dioxide emissions are actually higher, about 11% higher than they were last year, even though we have significantly less traffic. There was an interesting article from NPR 2 or 3 weeks ago talking about this has really been seen nationally. Prior to the pandemic, it was thought that, if we reduce the number of vehicles on the road, reduce those vehicle emissions, we should see a significant improvement in this particular measure. It didn't happen, and our air quality people are on this, and they're looking at really the nitrogen dioxide and ozone formation is extremely complicated. I don't even pretend to understand it all, but heat plays a big role in this, and our background ozone levels do too. And so, once again, I think one of the lessons learned out of this pandemic, I think, will be looking at how ozone is impacted by transportation, and perhaps we need to change how we approach our ozone issues here in Maricopa County. Go to the next slide. I'd like to turn over to Amy, talk about virtual mag and kind of the internal organizational side and kind of how we plan to transition. Amy?
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. And hello to members of the MAG Management Committee. It's a pleasure to see all of you. Our transition plan is under development. The protocols are informed by CDC and OSHA guidance. The plan includes a timeline, preparation, and phased return that prioritizes the well-being of staff and visitors while maintaining high levels of productivity. This plan is being informed by a staff survey that has been sent out to all of our employees. We are collecting their input on innovations that have been developed in response to the pandemic, but that can be maintained moving forward. We're also collecting really good information about their preferences and their priorities about their transition and coming back into the office. We will be continuing to offer virtual meetings at least throughout the summer. We will continue to track the conditions such as the pandemic very closely. We want to make sure that if we're bringing people together in person, that we can do so safely with the proper protocols and equipment in place. We will continue to offer remote participation as well as streaming videos for the public so that they can always be part of our meetings in this way. Staff will continue to telecommute at least throughout the end of the summer. This is in response to the pandemic, as well as in response to the limitations on childcare with many of the summer camps being closed. But we do want you to know that we're always here to assist you. And if you need us at any time, please do reach out. We stand ready to serve. That concludes my presentation. I would be happy now to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, that completes this part of our agenda. Be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you to both of you. Appreciate that very much. Are there any questions from the membership? All right, not hearing any. Thanks very much for that report. Interesting information. All right, let's move on to the next item, which is item 6, and that's the draft fiscal year 2021 Freeway Life Cycle Program. This is an action item. MAG staff John Bullen will provide the report. Mr. Bullen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Management Committee. Happy to be here today to join you for the next 2 agenda items. Next slide, please. So the Freeway Lifecycle Program, or FLCP as we call it for short, is the management tool for the Prop 400 Freeway program. If you recall, we last approved the program back in September. Really what this amounted to was the formal approval of the 1.5 year long rebalance process. And as part of that process, we made a commitment to go through an annual update process whereby we would more incrementally update program revenues, program costs, and update schedule changes. Next slide, please. So when we put together the Proposition 400 program, we used a combination of different revenue sources. So for the Freeway program itself, it combines the half-cent sales tax, known as the Regional Area Road Fund, or RARF, on the highway side. Also, a portion of Highway User Revenue Fund, HERF, dollars, in addition to a portion of federal funding that's allocated on a statewide basis. So every fall, we go through a process to update the RARF and HERF forecast. We work hand in hand with ADOT as well as a panel to do that. And then the forecast of federal funds is also updated annually, largely based on the latest Federal Transportation Act. So this year there wasn't a whole lot of changes, given that we're still operating under the FAST Act. Next slide, please. So as part of the rebalance process, we also made a commitment to work with ADOT and the program management consultant to update projects at least twice a year. So in this year's update, we actually updated all project costs as of January. So fairly recent information. That of course captures all the latest bid information, all the latest trend in pricing, and really gives us an up-to-date feel for how much these projects are going to cost. Next slide, please. So a couple notable changes in this update. As I had noted, since we just approved the program back in September, not a whole lot of change since then. Probably the biggest is that we've actually moved away from how the program had been operating, which is in current year dollars, and we're actually moving to a year of expenditure-based cash flow. So there's an assumption of inflation built into project costs moving forward. This was one of the findings that led to the rebalance, and we're optimistic that the switch will actually eliminate or reduce opportunity for error moving forward. We also incorporated a couple different project updates. So one of them, I-10 from 85 Dorado Way. If you remember, that's an item that we had discussed back in January. Management committee had considered a material change to that project. Following that meeting, we worked closely with the city of Buckeye, with ADOT, to evaluate different alternatives, look at different scenarios. Ultimately, it was decided to commit to the base project scope, and so that's included in this update. We also have changes to the I-10 project. That's the widening between here and Casa Grande, and then advanced design for both the 101 and the 202. Next slide, please. So the cash flow on the screen shows where we stand pre-COVID. So throughout the presentation, you probably identified that the revenues had been updated in the fall and the costs had been updated prior to COVID. So as you can see, our fund balance is actually in pretty good shape. We would end the program with approximately $300 million surplus, which is good news, because as I'll talk about here in a minute, we do expect a revenue drop off with COVID. Next slide, please. So as we're developing the annual update, this is really a lengthy process that starts all the way back in the fall. And really due to the transportation conformity process and needing to model and go through the public involvement process, we really have to button up the program in February. So obviously that was done prior to COVID. We do know we have March actual sales tax collections. So comparing to the last fiscal year, March sales tax collections are, for the RARF funds, are down about 5.5% compared to last year. And then for the HERF, it's down about 13.5% compared to last year. So we haven't yet received April sales tax collections. This is something that we continue to track closely. We'll be monitoring it. In between the time we developed the program and now, ADOT has actually generated some preliminary estimates. Unfortunately, they didn't have any data available for which to base these estimates on. So it's anticipated that they'll continue to tweak and adjust as needed. But they are forecasting a pretty significant decrease in both the sales tax funding and the HERF funding. So cumulative over 3 years, It's about a 14% decrease in the sales tax funding and a 15% decrease in the HERF funding. Just to test the resiliency of the program, really, we ran a cash flow scenario with those updated revenues. So the good news is, in the short term, the program would stay in balance. In fact, we would remain in balance even with the decreased revenues through the end of fiscal year 2023. And really what that does is affords us the opportunity to monitor things, to be a little more deliberate, systematic in our approach. I think we feel that if we are going to see a decrease of 14-15% on the revenue side, there's an expectation that we'll see some relief on the cost side as well. Certainly as we're factoring in things like inflationary increases in the future. So we'll monitor that closely. Any additional revenues that come on the federal side too would further fortify the program. So I think we're cautiously optimistic, but it's something that we have been and will continue to be tracking very closely. And certainly we'll be providing updates to the committees as we move forward. Next slide, please. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks for that update. Are there any questions from the membership?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is Brad. John, with COVID, is there any indication on what that might do to construction costs? I know some materials might be harder to get, but if you remember, costs were escalating. I don't know if the pandemic has maybe slowed down some of the increases, or any indication on that?
Mr. Chairman, members of the management committee, that's actually a really good question. So we did have discussion with ADOT. They brought in a couple of consultants, mostly on the infrastructure side, to sort of talk about what some of the anticipated impacts would be. I think construction pricing, particularly in our market, does have a lot to do with sort of the residential and commercial development. So, depending on what that market does in the future, we could, see some price increases or decreases, and something that we will track closely. I will also say too that we have 2 projects going to bid this month: State Route 24, as well as the 303 widening project. And we're really paying close attention to where those bids come in, and I think will give us an indication about pricing in the future. So unfortunately, things are uncertain for us too, but over the next couple of months, we'll have a little bit more information.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks for the question, Brad. Are there any other questions? John, I have a question regarding the projected decline in right-of-way costs, and I'm just curious as to what that might be based on. Is that real-time data that ADOT is seeing already, or is it forecasted? And if it's forecasted, is the fund balance that's also forecasted include a decline or projected decline in right-of-way costs?
So, Mr. Chairman, in the program that we're approving today, it's based on both the revenue and the cost numbers that were developed based in January. I had sort of touched on a scenario that was run plugging in the updated revenue numbers, which obviously are lesser than what they had been. And in that scenario, we're actually not doing anything on the cost side. And so in some degree, we're continuing to assume between a 4% and a 5% right-of-way and construction cost inflation year over year through the end of the program, while seeing decreases on the revenue side. So the note was more, I think, indication that if we are going to continue to see pretty significant revenue decreases, at some point the economy will probably slow down a little bit, and the hope is that right-of-way prices will come back to reality. But we have not seen any new data. State Route 30 right-of-way acquisition efforts continue. And so with that, ADOT right-of-way, continues to sort of work with parcel owners, but we haven't seen any drop yet.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. I appreciate it. Are there any other questions?
Listening to them drone on.
Any other questions? I'm not sure if I'm getting some feedback. Just a reminder, if you are not speaking, if you could please put your speaker on mute, that would be appreciated. All right, this is an action item, and I'm looking for a motion for approval. Is there anyone who would like to make a motion for approval?
So moved. This is Grady Miller.
All right,
Second.
thank you, Grady.
Julie and Goodyear.
All right, thank you, Julie. We got a motion made by Grady Miller from Fountain Hills and a second by Julie Arundel and Goodyear. Any further discussion on the motion? All right, I need to do a roll call vote by agency again. I'll start alphabetically as we've been doing. Apache Junction, what is your vote?
Yes.
Thank you. ADOT.
Aye.
Thank you. Avondale. Buckeye.
Aye.
Carefree. Cave Creek. Chandler.
Aye.
El Mirage.
Aye.
Florence.
Aye.
Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation. Fountain Hills.
Aye.
Gila Bend. Gila River Indian Community. Gilbert.
Aye.
Glendale. Glendale. Aye, thank you. Goodyear.
Aye.
Guadalupe.
Aye.
Litchfield Park.
Aye.
Maricopa County.
Aye.
City of Maricopa.
Aye.
Mesa.
Aye.
Paradise Valley. Peoria.
Aye.
Phoenix.
Aye.
Brown County.
Aye.
Creek is an aye. RPTA Valley Metro.
Aye.
Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. Scottsdale.
Aye.
Surprise. Tempe. Holliston. Wickenburg. And Youngtown. All right, did I miss anyone? All right, thank you. The motion passes. Thanks very much for that. Let's move on to item 7 is the Diamond Grind Pilot Program. Mr. Bullen, you're up again for this presentation. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Management Committee. Next slide, please. So this is a follow-up from an item that we had first taken to the RTP Management Committee work group in March, and then the Management Committee a week or two after that. So presentation I have broken up into 2 different sections. The first is just a recap of several of the things that we had discussed back in March. And then the second portion of the presentation is really focusing on what we're proposing as part of the current action. So in consideration with the fact that we've already discussed many of the initial components, I'll move through that part of the presentation pretty quickly. Next slide, please. So as we had discussed, due to freeway concerns about freeway noise that really started in the early 2000s with the initial construction of the loop system, ADOT began ways to determine how they can mitigate some of that freeway noise. Ultimately, it was decided to put on a overlay of rubberized asphalt, which does reduce noise. And where we are today is that the vast majority, nearly all of the system is covered in a layer of rubberized asphalt. Next slide, please. So as you can see from the screen, most of the rubberized asphalt that we've put down is aging. And in fact, about half of the rubberized asphalt throughout the system has actually reached or exceeded its expected 10-year service life. There are portions of the system too with rubberized asphalt that's actually between 15 and 17 years. And just to emphasize, the expected service life is just 10 years. Next slide, please. So with aging infrastructure, as we might expect, we see problems. And so this graphic illustrates are really a measure of the sections of the freeway which we're categorizing as failing. So it combines several different metrics, but for simplicity's sake, shows where the rubberized asphalt is failing, and certainly those who drive the system can tell. Next slide, please. So putting together the age as well as the condition, we can see that we have a lot of replacement needs out there, quite expensive. Next slide, please. So to get a better hold of both the situation today as well as some of the alternatives, MAG and ADOT partnered on a study. We had presented this study to the RTP management work group in March and then the management committee. Next slide, please. And at the time, I think we really illustrated that there's trade-offs. And so, you know, with rubberized asphalt, installation of it actually provides the largest amount of sound reduction quality. However, over time, it deteriorates to the point where at the end of the service life, it doesn't really diminish sound any bit more than a concrete surface. Whereas if you go with one of the quiet concrete surfaces, the change is relatively static over time. And then on the other hand, the concrete-based surfaces, they don't crack, they don't chip, and the road remains much smoother over time. And of course, there's a number of other considerations. Next slide, please. With one of them top of mind right now being cost. And so evaluating the different options over time, if you were to stick with rubberized asphalt compared to a diamond grind treatment, over a 25-year period for the entirety of the system, it would cost an approximately additional $300 million, which is fairly significant. Next slide, please. So based on that, and there were certainly lots of, I think, really good discussion, really good feedback, we worked with ADOT to develop a diamond grind pilot program. Next slide, please. So over the last couple of months, we've been reviewing all the different projects that we have funded through the Freeway Lifecycle Program, through the Proposition 400 program, to really determine which projects would be good candidates to go with a diamond grind, a diamond grind overlay rather than a rubberized asphalt overlay. Next slide, please. And what we've done is we've come up with three, which I'll be talking about a little bit today. So the first one is the 101 widening between I-17 and Pima. For those of you that drive that section of the freeway probably know, it's currently under construction. It's been under construction. The second project also under construction is the 101 between Baseline and 202. And then the third project is the 101 up in the Northwest Valley between 75th Avenue and I-17. So for both the Pima freeway between I-17 and Pima and the Price freeway between Baseline and 202, those are actually projects that were set to have rubberized asphalt installed this spring. One of the challenges with rubberized asphalt is that there's very narrow windows for which the contractors can actually go in and do the paving work. Temperatures have to be in a certain range. So really contractors can only do that in the spring and the fall. So all the construction activities have to be timed around that sequencing, which presents some challenges. So in order to actually prevent the contractors from installing rubberized asphalt and then having to go back out and tear it up, we actually worked with the adjacent communities to make sure that there was a comfort level with switching to diamond grind prior to this presentation. And then, of course, we have the 101 between 75th Avenue and I-17. It's not scheduled for construction for a couple of years, but will be starting to design. Next slide, please. So once the diamond grind is installed, ADOT will monitor it and consider a number of different attributes. They'll use it to project life cycle costs. They'll also look at quality of ride metrics. And then a big one, I think, is the public acceptance of a ground concrete surface. So portions of the 202 down in Chandler actually have diamond grind on it now. ADOT has reported that feedback has been extremely favorable. I think people appreciate the smooth surface, particularly relative to some of the chipping that we're seeing with rubberized asphalt in other areas. So what we're really looking for today is formal approval to modify those 3 project scopes to take out the rubberized asphalt and go with a diamond ground surface treatment. We're also looking for approval that if for one reason or the other, the region decides that diamond grind isn't the way to go in the future, then to provide the necessary funding to restore the project scope element, the rubberized asphalt, and put down an overlay in the future. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Do any members of the management committee have any questions? Any questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Bullen. This item's on for action as indicated. Looking for a motion, recommend approval of the Diamond Grind pilot program. Anybody have a motion for approval?
So move. This is Bill Stevens.
All right, Bill, thank you. A second? Anybody have a second?
Second.
And I didn't catch who that second was.
Kalaga.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, any further discussion on the motion? All right, not hearing any, let's go ahead and do this roll call vote. I'm going to begin with Apache Junction. What is your vote?
Yes.
Thank you. ADOT?
Aye.
Avondale? Buckeye?
Aye.
Carefree? Cave Creek? Chandler?
Aye.
El Mirage?
Aye.
Florence?
Aye.
Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation? Fountain Hills?
Aye.
Gila Bend? Gila River Indian Community? Gilbert?
Aye.
Glendale?
Before I vote, just want to thank staff for all the work and the outreach they did on this program, and I vote aye.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. Goodyear?
Aye.
Guadalupe?
Aye.
Litchfield Park?
Aye.
Maricopa County?
Aye.
City of Maricopa?
Aye.
Mesa?
Aye.
Paradise Valley? Peoria?
Aye.
Phoenix?
Yes.
Winona County?
Aye.
Queen Creek is an aye. RPTA Valley Metro?
Aye.
Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community? Scottsdale?
I also wanted to thank MAG staff for the legwork on this, and with that, I vote aye.
Thank you, Brad. Surprise? Tempe? Tolleson? Wickenburg? Youngtown? Have I missed anyone? All right, motion passes. Thanks very much. All right, let's move on to item 8. Item 8 is an update on the development of a new regional transportation plan. MAG staff Audra Kester Thomas will give this report. Audra.
Thank you, Chairman Cross, members of Management Committee. Pleased to be here with you today to give you an update on the latest activities associated with the development of the next regional transportation plan and, of course, extension of Proposition 400. Today's presentation really is a summary of a very constructive meeting we had with the Management Committee work group 2 weeks ago at the end of May, and I'll be providing you a summary of that meeting and providing feedback that we received at that meeting as well. Next slide. Focus of today is really over 3 main topics. First, we're going to revisit the call for projects, provide a better characterization now that we've had a chance to go through those submissions about the kind of buckets of projects, if you will, that we received. I'm also going to provide an update on our sketch estimates that we initially did last fall, now informed with information that did come through with the call for projects. And then visit again the draft evaluation-based evaluation framework, including the draft vision, goals, as well as regional significance definitions, for which we distributed about 3 weeks ago. And then conclude with the next steps. Next slide. So while we've provided some update on the initial call for projects, we've had some time now to review, and we wanted to give you more details of it. Next slide. But before we did that, wanted to spend some time characterizing our existing regional transportation plan and the Proposition 400 era programs. We at MAG and Valley Metro spend a lot of time talking about the three feature programs out of our Proposition 400 era programming, and that's our Freeway Lifecycle Program presented just now by John Bullen, Transit Lifecycle Program, and our Arterial Lifecycle Program. They compose the lion's share of investments that are funded from revenues, both federal and of the sales tax. But we do have, and I want to acknowledge, a handful, albeit smaller, regional programs that comprise smaller investments, localized investments. And this will be an important component as we move forward as part of the next development of the regional transportation plan. We envision that there'll be more programs like this. We have from federal formula funds, our 5310 program. We have a couple active transportation programs, both for infrastructure and design assistance. Several safety programs, including our Safe Routes to School and our RSA program, systems management and operations, several air quality programs, including pass-throughs and partners to regional rideshare and trip reduction, but also, of course, street sweepers, paving of unpaved roads. Our Don't Trash Arizona program, and litter and landscape on our freeways, as well as the Pinell County Arterial Bridge program. Next slide. You'll remember this slide from last month, really characterizes the number of submissions we received and into what major categories we received. Next slide. But we wanted to do a little bit deeper dive to better characterize the composition of those 1,300 submissions. And so today I'm going to quickly go through these 15 different buckets, if you will, of the kinds of projects we received and in no deliberate order. Next slide. Freeways, we certainly see new freeways being submitted as part of the call for projects, as well as parkways, but also capacity improvements, several system TIs, as well as reconstruction and modernization of our existing infrastructure. And as John Bullen said, I thought really well, it really characterizes in a large sense the status of our system in both still capacity adding and developing, but also now faced with some reconstruction efforts. Next slide. Arterial roadways, we were not disappointed, expecting to see several arterial improvements submitted as part of this call. Lots of new facilities, but in addition to that, capacity improvements to existing arterials, reconstruction and modernization of existing arterials, and then specific acknowledgement and support for implementing our freight planning work. Next slide. We saw lots of arterial intersection improvements. I think this surprised us a little bit, both minor and major arterial intersections, ITS improvements, and a note here about safety. You'll see this a thread throughout so many of these buckets, if you will, underlying components and improvements for safety. Next slide. A roadway other category, this includes some recommendations for projects along collectors, lots of bridges, both over new river crossings, but lots of railroad submissions, reconstruction, preservation, and maintenance, of course, of existing bridges across the system, roundabouts, complete streets, upgrading to standard facilities for the ability for ADOT to turn back those facilities to local communities, and again, safety improvements. Next slide. We've talked a lot about this in pavement preservation, and we certainly weren't disappointed with the submissions, considerable amount of arterial pavement preservation and actually beyond arterials in a lot of cases. Next slide. Commuter rail, both operations and capital, was submitted as part of the call for projects. Next slide. High capacity transit investments, more so than we had projected. In addition to long-term planned light rail extensions, as well as overlay service within the smaller footprint, a lot of streetcars were submitted across the region and significant support for implementation of regional bus rapid transit. Next slide. Category 8 here is our kind of regional bus service category, and this comprises I can't express enough, just a large grouping of projects. It certainly underscores the intent for continued investment for regional bus service, kind of the backbone of our transit system, but expansion as well of our regional grid network. And continued investment and enhancement to our express and commuter bus service, fleet and asset management that goes along with the operations and maintenance associated with transit investments, park and rides, and transit centers. We're a really robust submission as part of the call for projects. Next slide. We also received other transit submissions, a significant amount of circulators and microtransit ideas, first and last mile solutions, localized, perhaps on demand or flexible kinds of options, focus on transit accessibility, particularly to high capacity investments, but attention to bus stops and transit stops, ADA improvements, specialized services to specialized populations. Next slide. And then active transportation, above and beyond what we received and planned out in the accepted active transportation plan. If I were to characterize what we received in the active transportation selections, is a real distinct investment in buffered or separated facilities. Again, focus on safety, bike boulevards, and otherwise dedicated facilities for bike and pedestrians. Next slide. And again, I've said this word a lot. You see this thread cut across these buckets, but safety. There were some specific safety investments and programs delineated as part of the call. Continuation of the Safe Routes to School program, continuation of our RSAs, educational programming, traffic calming techniques, and specific infrastructure improvements across modes. Next slide. Again, continuation of support for ITS in this region, a lot of fiber focus and the continuity of a system from a communications perspective. See support for a lot of the concepts that came out of MAG's SM&O plan from a couple of years ago, and acknowledgement of emerging technologies. We may not know what those are yet, but certainly recognition that we should be setting aside funding for those things that we don't yet know of. Next slide. Transportation demand management, both at a local level, but also as a regional level, capital and operations support. Next slide. And then continuation of transportation planning support in form of studies, acknowledgement for an opportunity for pilot programs, allow us to test out potential ideas, traffic counts and the support of that in our planning efforts, inventory and asset management support, as well as administrative support for federal funding. Next slide. And then another category, this is just a collection of a couple of the examples that we received that don't necessarily fit well within either the 14 other categories we've outlined. City street sign replacements, traffic signals, replacements of lights, LED conversions, utility relocations, public art maintenance. You see, tree replacement programs. So a variety of things that could fall in this particular category. Next slide. Want to make a note of what we didn't see that surprised us a little bit in the call. A lot of attention to our air quality programs. Clearly, we are in a non-attainment area. We have federal funding specifically that must address mitigation and strategies associated with mitigating our air quality. We didn't see submissions for street sweepers or rideshare program. We acknowledge and believe that are to be significant support for, but also know that we have to include and have the RTP cover, of course, air mitigation strategies, including these or others, and really no unpaved roads or paving of unpaved roads, with the exception of the Gila River Indian community, who certainly submitted several. Also, acknowledgement of a freeway management system, lots of support from that across the region, of course, but didn't see any necessarily specific submissions of it or any large scale technology investments, although we have heard from you previously that there's support for that consideration moving forward. Next slide. So we also took some time over the last couple of weeks as we looked further into these calls for projects to take a look again at our sketch estimates that we originated last fall. Next slide. You'll remember, as part of our ongoing conversations for enabling legislation last fall, we wanted to provide a little bit more information on what we saw in potential estimates, not just for projected revenues, but also for costs, and in particular to underscore, as we look forward to the extension of Proposition 400, that we're not getting to start fresh. And in fact, not only with the Great Recession and a projected 40% less in revenues over the 20-year horizon of Proposition 400, certainly a cast of deferred projects that we wouldn't otherwise been able to afford. Certain bus service isn't going to get implemented. Freeway improvements and arterial investments will not ultimately be forwarded as part of Proposition 400 because of that reduction in projected revenue. But also to acknowledge that we walk in with some encumbered already investments, specifically in operations, and specific to that, bus operations. There is a acknowledgement that the region is supporting bus operations, and that's not a commitment that ends. In fact, from member agencies' perspective, I think there's an anticipation that that's going to increase as we move forward into this planning process. And so we wanted at last fall to give a little bit better understanding of the context of our revenue and cost picture. And so we included the information we knew from deferred projects, as well as those that we had studied over the course, from a system-wide perspective, over the course of the last 10, 15 years or so, but acknowledged that we hadn't yet been able to identify safety costs or arterials, and certainly had not yet heard from you, from our member agencies. So next slide. You'll remember this slide where we outlined at that point some of our sketch estimates. And looking back to fall, we were estimating approximately a $50 to $60 billion summary of varying regional potential investments, and then juxtapose that to our sketch revenue estimates, which at the time was approximately $30 billion. You'll see noted there an acknowledgement that we do have to fuel our high capacity transit investments in the region, the opportunity to compete nationally for discretionary funding for those transit projects. And CIG, we've been very successful in landing for several or all of our high capacity projects to date. We'd anticipate another few $1 billion, of course, associated with implementation of our continued implementation, if you will, of our high capacity transit portfolio. Next slide. So over the last weeks, as mentioned, we've combed through the information we received and want to update some of these sketch estimates based on the call for projects. A couple things still to note, however. This is still an order of magnitude analysis, high level, back of the napkin, if you will. Only about half the submissions came in with cost estimates, and amongst those cost estimates, a variety of inconsistency across them. And so some more refined because some of your work is very near term. Others are really just guesses at this point. So we're going to have to do considerable amount more work and better understanding and doing better projections on those costs, but did want to at least reflect back what we see at this point in terms of exploring some of these concepts from the call for projects. Next slide. So what you'll see here, this slide representing some updated information, and it largely reflects some of the information we received as part of this call for projects. You'll see an inclusion of more freeway projects than we had last fall, an uptick in our active transportation above and beyond the active transportation plan that was just accepted, additional technology investments, a higher amount of arterial operations and maintenance than we anticipated last fall. You'll see a considerable jump in the high capacity transit as well. We received several more projects than we had at least estimated at last fall timeframe. You'll see now here at the two bottom categories, arterials and safety, these weren't covered as we acknowledged last fall, and the call for projects certainly included a robust number of arterials. You'll see here, we're estimating between $6 and $12 billion worth of projects submitted, and then of course safety threaded throughout all of this. Taken as a whole, this increases our anticipated costs now to $60 to $90 billion. I want to make a note, you'll see bus transit has an asterisk next to it. We received a robust amount of bus service improvements, and that's really a service planning exercise for which we'll be partnering with Valley Metro, of course, as well as the City of Phoenix. Those estimates are consistent with the work we did with Valley Metro and City of Phoenix last year, so we've held those steady. But please note that based on the call for projects, that number is low relative to the requests that came in. So we're expecting that number to increase as well. On the revenue side, you don't see much change, fairly static, with the only exception being federal discretionary transit funding. With the increase of high capacity transit projects submitted, again, we'd anticipate, if successful, we'd have a higher amount of federal funding partnership with CIG competitiveness as well. So we've increased that funding a bit. And I think what you see here is a picture we acknowledged would happen, when we included feedback about the vastness of need in this region. You see a continued disproportionality between available revenues and the needs identified already. So before I move on, as part of the rest of the presentation, I've said a lot. This has been a lot of information. I'm going to pause here just for a moment, Chairman Cross, in case you or the committee has any particular questions at this point in time.
All right, thank you, Audra. Are there any questions at this point in the presentation? Okay, Audra, I think you can continue.
Thank you. Next slide. I would say the lion's share of our meeting really was spent with the draft vision, goals, and definitions for regional significance. And so I'll present those to you. You've had them for several weeks now, but in part really share with you the feedback that we received. A really good conversation at our management committee work group. Next slide. You'll see presented here our draft vision and goals. I think we had a lot of good conversation. Direction seemed to be that this is consistent, with what we want to achieve in this region. In terms of the vision statement at the top, an acknowledgement perhaps that word deserve in the final sentence may need to be reevaluated. Is that really the term we mean and want to say? But in the specific goals at hand here, I don't think we heard any additions necessarily, or any of these that didn't necessarily fit. In terms of our resiliency goal, I think we were given some suggestions to maybe work or refine the wording there to make sure we're recognizing and really saying what we mean in terms of the portfolio of being providing a redundant system, as well as being flexible looking into the future. For our quality of life goal there, I think a suggestion to really focus on the public health and environmental sustainability elements that we have nestled underneath that term quality of life, or perhaps an overused construct. Safety, I would say lots of support and specific direction to prioritize this goal, strengthening it to recognize perhaps our more vulnerable populations or users of the system, particularly our bicyclists and pedestrians. Lot of conversation about our system preservation goal here, recognizing that this region has invested over $10 billion already into a multimodal system, but then discussions about responsibility and the funding associated with continuing its maintenance and operation. And then finally, with that mobility goal at the end, acknowledgement that equitable access really needs to take into consideration that transportation investments aren't universal, that they need to take into consideration and be responsive to the differences in land use or development patterns, particularly as we look across our extremely diverse region. Next slide. We also talked about how these draft goals really align with and are in keeping with the direction from our feds and the funding that flows into the region via formula. You'll see here the draft goals that were presented really either directly or provide significant support to the federal planning goals that FHWA has articulated as part of the last FAST Act. Next slide. We also talked a lot, and I think had a really robust conversation about our definitions for regionally significant project and program. Next slide. You'll see here, we reviewed how we got to these draft constructs. Of course, first taking our guidance from the feds and in what regional benefit and federal formula funds that come through to our region are intended for. We looked at a lot of other regions and other RTPs to glean anything from them. And what I can report is that there isn't one size fits all solution to regional significance. Some regions have a specific system. They identify the high capacity investments as part of a system, and that's what's regionally significant. Others use an order of magnitude, so a threshold. There's a minimum amount a project has to be in terms of costs, several $100,000, for example, before it's being determined to be regionally significant. But we really spent some time over the last month or two to review what you had, what you said, and why the projects you submitted were important to you, combing through and identifying what was significant about those projects so that we can inform these definitions. And then, of course, wanted to ensure that we are being consistent with historic precedent of propositions 300 and 400. Next slide. And so you'll see here two distinct definitions, one for a regionally significant project. You know, these are those discrete standalone projects that we would include in our model, of course, and be able to discretely evaluate and assess how they are moving towards our varying goals decided by our policymakers. But you also notice here regionally significant program definition. And this really was deliberate on the team's part to acknowledge that, you know, there are collections of projects, perhaps that are smaller or more unique to different parts of the region or to different needs across the region and circumstances. But they still represent priorities for the region. And so we wanted to be inclusive by including this regionally significant program definition that could potentially capture some of that diversity that we see across our region, but also to provide some of that level of flexibility that we've heard from you is really important when we're developing our next regional transportation plan. I would note that most of our conversations really were just discussing and conversing about these two definitions, acknowledgement that an activity center is inclusive, of course, as well of an employment center and access to jobs. So I'd say that was the only discrete note we received on those definitions, but a really robust conversation, good information provided to us at this point in the presentation. Next slide. So as I finish up, I just want to hit a couple high points of what next summer and fall look like from where we go from here. Next slide. Once we get concurrence from our policymakers, continue to invite and seek feedback on our goals in particular. We want to come back then with a menu of potential evaluation criteria, ways that we can measure both quantitatively as well as qualitatively our ability to move closer towards those things that you've identified as priorities. And we'd like to do that as soon as July, but only upon concurrence from our policymakers. Once we're able to pull together our full needs catalog, so that's inclusive not just of the call for projects, but our deferred projects, as well as those that have been studied to date. That's a heavy lift. We'll want to then apply once you've given direction on the kinds of evaluation criteria. Towards the end of the summer and fall, we want to provide that initial technical assessment and see where we stand in terms of projects that are getting us our higher priorities perhaps, or otherwise delivering towards our outcomes and goals that we've identified. And then use this fall and winter to do some scenario planning where we can look at different suites of projects and potentially different investment strategies to see what kinds of portfolios of work can be delivered within fiscal constraint. But really an opportunity, again, through an iterative planning process to continue to get feedback and seek feedback in your direction along the way, so that we can provide the best technically sound information as possible for this process. So Chairman Cross, that concludes my presentation. I'll request that we go back 2 slides, perhaps to that regional significance definition, leave it there, and happy to answer any questions from Management Committee.
All right, thank you, Audrey. I appreciate that. Does any member of the Management Committee have any questions, comments?
This is Julian Goodyear.
Hi, Julie.
Thank you, Audra, for the presentation, and hearing it a second time has been really helpful as well. I appreciated your comments on the importance of the historical regional significance. Of course, having some projects that have not only been studied, but have had dollars expended on right-of-way acquisition. I just wanted to ensure that as we're ranking the projects that you've received, that there is, sufficient weight given to the deferred projects as we develop that ranking criteria. Thank you.
Any other
John?
comments? Yes, Mr. Smith.
Yeah, Dr. Scott Smith. Hey, and Audra, I'm sorry if you covered this. I got pulled away for 1 minute during your presentation. But in those total costs and the projects, how much our costs are included for state of good repair, both on the other than for overlays and things like that? How much the cost consideration for upgrading and fixing and that which we've already built?
Chairman Cross, Mr. Smith, those estimates that we included in the service operations were a partnership between Valley Metro and City of Phoenix that we did last fall, a little bit of a project that did include some assumptions accordingly for bus replacements, transit asset management activities. And so while it's inclusive of some of those assumptions, it is not necessarily reflective of the system improvements that are included in this call for projects. In other words, we're going to have to work more deliberately now with City of Phoenix and Valley Metro to better understand from a service planning exercise what we've received thus far, and then able to layer in deliberately transit asset management aspects, including bus replacement, fleet replacement, activities associated, of course, with rail, but also something that's near and dear to our heart, the things that we've perhaps forgotten in the past. And, I think an example that we like to use a lot is the farebox recovery and upgrade system, for which we didn't necessarily include in Proposition 400, but clearly is a regional investment. And working with Valley Metro, MAG, last year, we're able to find enough federal funding associated. So we want to deliberately spend some time working through that. We have included, like I say, some assumptions, leaning on Valley Metro and Phoenix, but we need to do a lot deeper dive, especially once we start forwarding potential transit plans so that we can ensure to capture adequately our operations and maintenance components of transit.
Hey, thank you, and I appreciate that. I guess I have a broader question, which I wonder about this whole program, which includes everything. It includes transit and obviously our state of good repair on both the bus and the rail side, which is significant. But I guess the basic question I would ask is that what resources are we going to have to take off the top to maintain and basically rebuild what we've already built, freeways, streets, other things, including light rail lines and things like that, before we can really contemplate new projects or expansions or additions? To me, that's a very basic question, because I've heard, ridiculously high, not ridiculously, very high numbers that say that we're going to be taxed significantly from taking care of what we have, and before we ever get into consideration of expansion of the entire transportation system.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, I believe that is in fact a fundamental question that we will be faced with moving forward, and we don't have an answer to that yet. We want to simply provide this information. On the transit side, we have a lot more work to do, especially given the call for projects. So, with Valley Metro's partnership, we had another meeting this morning, and City of Phoenix, of course. We're going to deliberately provide that information to our policymakers to weigh those enormous trade-offs that we have ahead, and recognize it's not going to be easy, but certainly a different and unique characteristic, I think, of this program and the extension of Proposition 400 that's unique from its predecessors.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Ed.
Yeah, Ed, go ahead.
Thanks.
I said a few of these things in the previous meeting, but I would bring them back again. I think particularly focusing on the goals, and first of all, thank you to the staff for doing that, and Audra did a good job of restating what we had all said, so thank you for that. I just would emphasize, I think on the safety bullet, right now it's written as focusing on the traveling public, which seems to orient towards driving. And in the region and the state with the highest pedestrian fatality rate in the country, I think we need explicitly to talk about pedestrian safety when we're doing this. In the mobility area, it talks about the word equitable access, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind, but the equitable is going to take some work, because equity in terms of access for transit is not, everyone should not expect to have equitable, to be able to have an equitable, the same level of transit service. Sorry, I'm stumbling on that word. The same level of transit service anywhere. It's not realistic. It's not how transit works. And it doesn't reflect individual community investment in transit, which makes a difference in it. So I don't think that the regional money has been distributed inequitably. I think it's, or unevenly. I think it's local investment that might be uneven there. So we just got to be careful with that, how we talk about that word. And then finally on regional significance, I think we also have to spend some significant time on that, because the definition is important, particularly as it relates to arterials and transit, so that we shouldn't expect a regional tax to take local priorities. And so defining that local and regional is really important. In Prop 2, when we were in Prop 400, we had some long discussions about regional means if it crosses city boundaries. And we talked about that's not really the accurate description of what regional means with the way our valley is laid out. So there's more dialogue needed in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate you underscoring those previous comments. Anyone else, questions or comments at this point? Audra, just an observation. I think, at least from my perspective, as we refine the criteria and the definitions and how we sort of navigate, that part of the next phases of things, I think, it would behoove us to also examine the last freeway rebalancing effort. It seemed to me that we struck that right balance between some of these issues we're currently talking about and also economic development needs within the region, particularly those areas within the region that have or are comprised of major job centers. And I just think that needs to really be fully vetted and have a really thoughtful discussion on by this group and others. So I would just offer that, but again, offer the time to anybody else that has any other questions or comments at this point before we move on.
Mr. Chair, just real quick, this is
Jeff.
Just such great comments, including what you just mentioned, Mr. Chair, and some of the other comments. Just to make sure, Audra, where we would be having some of those discussions about deferred projects, local contributions, how we deal with preservation and maintenance versus the local funding, and economic activity and how that plays in the scoring. Could you explain within the map that we're looking at when we can expect to have those conversations, especially within the working group?
Certainly. And thank you all for your contributions thus far. So the evaluation or criteria, the technical evaluation components, that's more of a near term. So once we are able to fully vet these goals, we want to come back to the work group in particular first with some draft evaluation criteria. So from a technical perspective, how can we evaluate projects and their ability to deliver on some of these outcomes and priorities for which you're articulating? And so that would really be hopefully as soon as July, as long as we're continuing to get positive feedback and moving forward. Regarding some of the policy considerations in terms of local match or proportionality of funding, different funding alternatives, considerations of portfolios of projects, we're really planning on using that or doing and evaluating those kinds of options, because I think there's several levers to push and pull through our scenario planning exercise later this year. So once we're able to kind of technically evaluate the merits of projects and be able to identify what they achieve, then we can start to evaluate how and in what ways we can deliver different suites of projects. And if we include or increase or diversify our funding portfolio, what does that mean in terms of the kinds or composition of projects that can be delivered? So it's a two-part answer. The technical evaluation aspects, they're nearer term because we want to be able to evaluate not only just the suite of projects that came in through the call, but as we've already identified, varying system-wide needs that have been studied over the last 10 or 15 years. But then later also be able to do some scenario planning. And if we change some of the baseline assumptions or modify different assumptions, funding or otherwise, what does that mean for a portfolio of projects that we could potentially deliver? So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Audra, it does. Thank you. I think just a note of consideration would be some of those items maybe prior to the scenario planning, if we can work through some of those items so that then when we go through the scenarios, they reflect some of where we're at mutually on those. But no, thank you. Very helpful.
Certainly.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Anyone else? Questions or comments, other feedback? Okay, thanks very much. Audra, just, as we continue with this schedule, remind me, is it really at the scenario planning stage when we start to really sort of winnow down the list, if you will, reshape the, all the call for projects? Is that is the first cut kind of the September month?
Mr. Chairman, members of Management Committee, yes, it is iterative as we move through this process for sure. I think we'll be able to really see later this fall, September, I think you've identified, Mr. Chairman, potential identification of the highest performing projects from a technical perspective, but I don't want to speak in underlying or at least emphasizing we have lots of trade-offs ahead. And I think we're going to be seeking feedback on some big conversations about what are our highest priorities. I mean, there is no doubt we have a tremendous amount of need throughout the region, but we're going to have to make some discrete choices about, well, this is a higher priority now than this, and it doesn't diminish the need necessarily. It just is a reflection of the fiscal constraint. So it comes and it's iterative, Mr. Chairman. I think we'll be able to provide some meaningful information, not just the call for projects, but kind of that needs catalog in general, September, October, and then feeding that into our ultimately our conversations about the investment strategies and that scenario planning through the winter, and then really developing the groundwork for some of those key trade-off questions. This is really a high priority and this is a high priority. We can't afford both, just as a simplistic way of placing it into early next year. And we'll use that feedback from our policymakers to build the draft plan.
Okay, thank you for that. Appreciate that. All right, unless there's any other questions that have come to mind since then, why don't we go ahead and move on to the next item. Roger, thank you very much. A lot of complex work. Appreciate all the updates and the work that you and the entire team are doing on that. Okay, election of officers, which is item number 9, the election of Management Committee officers. And before I begin, I just want to take a moment and thank everyone for the opportunity to serve alongside of you. Really appreciate getting to know some of the managers better than I would otherwise have as just a member of the committee. And I do appreciate this fine plaque, by the way, that the MAG staff has provided with me, or to me. Thank you very much for that. And in particular, relative to the staff too, just want to thank Eric for all of his leadership, support, and guidance in this role, and the entire team at MAG. You've all been just absolutely outstanding. So I just want to, open up with those particular comments, and also thank Julie, who's moving into this role here very shortly and continue to lead us forward through the regional transportation plan and some of these other complex issues. So I think with that, let me just remind everybody that each June, of course, that's where we're at. The positions of chair and vice chair are elected by the management committee, and according to the MAG committee operating policies and procedures, which have been approved by the MAG Regional Council, the chair works with the members to nominate a manager for the vice chair position, and the current vice chair is nominated for the position of chair. And as everybody knows, the positions serve as 1-year terms. So does any member of the management committee have any questions at this time? All right, not hearing any. With that, I would like to open up for a formal motion for the chair and vice chair.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Hi, this is Jeff over in Peoria. Just a quick comment before a motion, which was I wanted to also thank and congratulate you for just a wonderful job as you steered all of us, both personally and virtually, over the last year. Just a really admirable job, and really helped the flow of the conversation. And it's been great to get to know you better. So thank you for that.
Likewise. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that.
And I would like to move to nominate Julie Arundel as the new incoming MAG Management Chair.
Second.
All right, we have a motion for Julie and a second by Ed. Any further discussion by members? Are we going to do a second motion, Eric? Let me just ask you procedurally for the vice chair, or do you want to include that?
Mr. Chairman, I was going to suggest that if we can get the motion maker to amend that motion to include a vice chair,
okay,
then we could just do the roll call once, just to
got it.
economize.
Yeah. Let's do that. So Jeff, are you okay to amend your motion to add a vice chair?
Yes. Is there any sense of a vice chair?
Yeah, that's I believe that's Andrew Ching in the Tempe.
Great. I would like to amend my motion to nominate Julie Arundel as the incoming MAG Management Chair and to nominate Andrew Ching of Tempe as the vice chair.
Second accepts that amendment.
All right, thank you, Ed. Any further discussion by members of the committee? All right, not hearing any. Let's go ahead and do this roll call vote. Eric, let's quickly do that. Apache Junction, your vote. ADOT. Avondale. Buckeye.
Aye.
Carefree. Cave Creek. Chandler.
Aye.
El Mirage.
Aye.
Florence.
Aye.
Fort McNally by Nation. Fountain Hills.
Aye.
Gila Bend. Gila River Indian Community. Gilbert.
Aye.
Glendale. Goodyear. Guadalupe. Litchfield Park.
Aye.
Maricopa County.
Aye.
City of Maricopa.
Aye.
Mesa.
Aye.
Paradise Valley. Peoria.
Aye.
Phoenix.
Aye.
Pinal County.
Aye.
Queen Creek is an aye. RPTA Valley Metro.
Aye.
Salt River Pima Indian Community. Scottsdale.
Aye.
Surprise. Tempe. Tolleson. Wickenburg. Youngtown. Did I miss anyone? All right, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much for everybody. Just quickly moving on, and congratulations to Julie and Andrew. We really appreciate that. Request for future agenda items. Are there any requests by membership for an item on a future agenda? All right, not hearing any comments from the committee. Are there any announcements from the membership? All right, there are no remaining business items, gang. So let's, our business is now concluded. The meeting's adjourned. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.